There have been across continents a wide set of political activists and movements pushing for reparations in various forms as a response to that history. And regardless of the origin story of our ecological crisis or the political crisis that comes on the back end of colonialism, there's just the stark reality of what those histories have meant for wealth accumulation, and as I'll talk about in a few moments, the climate crisis itself. The vulnerability that we have to climate crisis is largely tied to the vulnerability people have to any sort of political crisis, which is largely determined, modified, sharpened, or dulled by income. So the distribution of income, where it resides geographically, at a large scale, if we're talking about countries, or at a smaller scale, if we're talking about neighborhoods, determines what level of security you can access to environmental problems. So what I've been proposing and defending over these past couple of years is this view of the world as a kind of large integrated political distribution system. The fact that we live in a world in this particular kind of political sense, a planet-sized system of production and distribution, is something new. It has only been, there were large networks of trade and cultural exchange in different eras of the world history, but it wasn't until the late 16th century that these got as large as the planet. And this scale helps explain partly why human activity has threatened the ecological stability of the entire planet. And they also explain a bit about the nature of the injustices that come with that size system and with that scale of oppression and exploitation. So broadly, I've been thinking of the global social structure that was built in the 16th century, or whose construction was, the first stage of its construction was complete by the 16th century, as something that was built by transatlantic slavery and colonialism. And among other things, it is a distributive system. So the advantages that are built out of that system, the technologies, the economic resilience, the wealth, the knowledge building capacity, the research universities, those things tend to accumulate in the global north and for racially dominant communities. The disadvantages, the pollution, the poverty, the exposure to violence, the lack of housing security, those problems tend to accumulate in the global south and in racially disadvantaged communities. And this holds at multiple scales. And there's, a vast amount of empirical work that leads me to describe the system in this way. But this is how I'm understanding what the world even is. And so understanding the world as having emerged from the history of transatlantic slavery and colonialism as being an actual system, an actual political and economic system that is planetary in size and whose properties explain why people face the challenges that they face, the oppression and exploitation that they face. I think that's the thing that we have to fix. So I'm happy to say more about this later in Q&A, but for now, I'll just say I prefer a view of reparations that tries to actually change the system that we're in. And I think that will lead to downstream changes to individual livelihoods, and to even social and economic relationships between people, between groups of people, between countries. But we have to actually change how the system operates, rather than just transferring cash or land from one group of people to another group of people, or just encouraging better interpersonal relationships, or thinking about reparations as a series of apologies or reconciliatory acts. I think there's a lot that those ways of thinking about reparations gets right, but I prefer the constructive view. I'm, again, happy to say more in Q&A later about it. But what reparations should do on this view is literally a world-making project. What we should be thinking about is the design of a different kind of system, or many systems across the planet, but we're responding to a situation in which there is really one planetary economic and political system. We should be thinking about how to rebuild that thing that we have now. And that's the way we should think about reparations. So if transatlantic slavery and colonialism built the racist world order that we have, I think the way that you would respond to that from the point of view of justice, which I take to be what reparatory justice involves, is literally a world-making project. And I want to stress the word literally. I think oftentimes when I talk about this subject, people just think that I mean something like a principle, and I'm using this idea of rebuilding the world metaphorically, that, you know, we need to just in general embrace fairness as a kind of moral aesthetic and oppose oppression everywhere we find it. And I certainly wouldn't disagree with that. But I'm actually talking about literal physical construction projects. The example that I used in the book is if you were, is taking a cue and taking some lessons from disability justice activism, right? Where if you were fighting to make buildings in a city wheelchair accessible, you would not be fighting for people to be, as a moral matter, opposed attitudinally to the idea of ableism. You would literally be fighting for people to put ramps where there had been stairs. It would be a concrete, literal project of changing what the streets are like and what access to buildings are like, so that people that use wheelchairs to get around can get into those buildings, right? So it is exactly that level of concrete, literal reality that I am saying this thing. We need to rebuild the world. The way in which we exchange goods, the decision-making structures that decide how energy is generated, for whom and for what purpose, those are the things that we need to alter if we want to achieve the values that reparatory justice aims for, in my view. I don't think this is a new understanding. I think, in fact, it was the prevailing one during the decolonial movements, during the anti-colonial nationalist movements, I think I should say, rather. So I'm just, taking a thought to what I take to be its logical conclusion that is very much not original to me, but I think building something on the scale of, a new international economic order, as they would have called it back then, is the scale of ambition that we should have. So just to recap the basic ideas so far, what the world is as a kind of system of politics and economics is a production distribution system. It makes things like wealth, like infrastructure, like information, and then it moves those things around. Certain people get access to the information, certain people get personal ownership over the wealth, and there are patterns in who gets access to the knowledge and who gets access to the toxic waste. And those patterns relate causally to the racist history of the construction of that system. That's the basic things that I've been arguing for over the past year. And if we wanted to do something about that, it wouldn't be a matter of reconciling the people who have been plundered and the people who are on the toxic waste end of the distribution, but it would be about reshaping what is produced, for what reasons, where it goes afterwards, and all of the rules and patterns by which those things are determined. So all that's very heady and abstract. So I want to try to get down from abstraction into the literal concrete project. What are the ramps that we should be building in place of the stairs of the past? So if we're thinking ecologically, we should obviously be thinking about our actual ecology, where the trees are, where the waters are. But I also think we should be thinking, of course, about our institutions. So just to make a quick point, a lot of the things we interpret as individual behavior and attitudes just are directly how we respond to decision making in environments, right? So what seems like the good choice depends on how we perceive our options, which depends on what the world is actually like around us. All I'm trying to say here is that institutions, laws, regulations are more powerful in shaping what the world is like than individual attitudes. So this is just, again, a reason to go beyond the idea of reparations as reconciliation. And one way that you can see this at work in a way that I think is clearly related to environmental justice is in the decisions that corporations make about green crimes. So when is it that corporations follow the laws and regulations around dumping toxic waste, and when do they ignore them? It was to have to do with broader realities of who's empowered and who's disempowered by the political systems that we've set up. Back in the 80s, they found that there was a strong correlation between the presence of Latino and Black Americans and the presence of toxic waste. Not because obviously there's any inherent relationship between those demographics and toxic waste, but because the ability of the law to actually bind and shape behavior of corporations that could dump toxic waste depends on the extent to which that law is seen as important, or the extent to which one would guess that the law would be enforced. We could tell this psychological story different ways, but the law just didn't protect, as a matter of fact, Latino and Black Americans from toxic waste to the same degree that it protected other people. And that is something that has been generalized upon. The green crime havens, some environmental justice theorists discuss, arise out of power differences. So by whatever mechanisms, more powerful, racially advantaged, wealthier communities are just better able to protect themselves from toxic waste for a variety of reasons, including zoning decisions. And it's not just at the neighborhood level. You can find this at much larger political scales. So in the book, Anna and Jeffrey and I, my colleagues, were using a climate change vulnerability index that had been produced by some other scholars, Adger, Brooks, and Kelly. And they found that climate vulnerability was tied to these broader measures of social protection. Right? So actually, GDP didn't correlate quite as well with climate vulnerability as these other things that measure more directly the extent to which people are protected by the wealth and infrastructure that exists in their country. So life expectancy, maternal mortality, dietary adequacy, these are the things that largely decided how intense the suffering was after climate problems. And they combined all these things in an index. And as you can see on the left, the countries that were colonizer countries are much safer. The lower numbers mean less vulnerable, are much safer from climate impacts than the countries that were colonized. This is just another set of graphs making the same point. But they live essentially in two different worlds. That's not a coincidence, but that is a result of how the world that we all live in has been constructed. The global economy, much like the kind of subnational neighborhood level that we could say about green crimes, the world economy is one big green crime haven. It funnels value to the north and toxins to the south. And proponents of this thing called ecological unequal exchange theory have given one kind of explanation of why. There are others like the pollution haven hypothesis, but broadly we can see that just empirically this is true, right? The countries that have it worse and that had it worse in the past have it worse now. So that's the thing we need to change, right? We need to change how it is that things flow, how it is that capital flows, that money flows, that knowledge flows, and how toxic waste flows. And those are things that we have to change if we want any kind of justice, including, of course, especially racial justice, justice for transatlantic slavery and colonialism. So what are the things that we could do to change how wealth flows in the planetary-sized economic and political system that we have now? I think there are a lot of great ideas here. I'm just going to put them on the screen. I'm not going to say very much about them, but I'll just briefly say about the first category, we could just give people money. We could give states money. We could just directly change how capital, how cash, how financing is distributed. There are a lot of mechanisms for doing this, but I think my bias is in favor of simplicity. Just give people money. The conditionality on forms of so-called development aid, the Byzantine networks of grants and such, I don't think is in general the best approach. I'm happy to say a bit more about why if folks are curious in the Q&A. But what I actually want to move to, also that money should come from polluters. I wanted to make sure to highlight that. But what I'd like to move to more directly is the question of power, because I think that is largely, that should have a centrality in our analysis of what we're going to do. I've been a bit cute about some of the studies that I've been talking about, saying, oh, it just so happens that the toxic waste ends up here, and it just so happens that the climate vulnerability ends up here, and we can see it, and there's a variety of reasons why it might. But, taking my academic wonk hat off for a second and putting my, more organizer hat on, there's no mystery about why, right? People make decisions, and the people in power prefer, largely speaking, that the money ends up where it ends up. They prefer that the infrastructure ends up where it ends up. The elites who can travel by plane to London when they need healthcare have less of an investment in making sure that suitable infrastructure exists in Nigeria or Namibia or South Africa than people who can't get on those flights and have to navigate the healthcare infrastructure in those places. So changing who gets to make the decisions about what is produced and where it's distributed after it's produced, whether we're talking about energy or healthcare dollars or whatever, I think that is of central importance to changing how the system operates. And again, there's way too many, the system is huge, it's complex, it's literally the size of the planet. There's a lot to talk about. So I just want to pick two things to share with you to lead us into Q&A. So one thing I would like to talk about is participatory budgeting, which many of you may have heard of, but just in case anyone hasn't, the direct democratic way of allocating funds. It was pioneered by the Brazilian Workers' Party after the end of the military dictatorship in Brazil. They started it at the city level in the city of Porto Alegre in '89, and they had a sort of town hall format where people went through the various social problems in Porto Alegre and the various city funds that they had to split up, and made direct democratic decisions about what money should go where. And so that was a very influential practice that was pioneered by the Brazilian Workers' Party there. It's been used lots of other places since. It's been used at scales larger than the city. The state of Kerala in India has largely built it into, its whole apparatus of decision making. Portugal has had a lot of participatory budgeting units at the local level, and it linked them nationally and created national level participatory budgeting units just a few years ago. So it can be done at scales much larger than a city, and in fact has been done and is being done at much larger scales than a city. And it's already being used to make material decisions about what to do about climate interventions. It's been used to strengthen agroecological food chains in Ecuador or reforest in the DRC. And I think it's definitely something that I think, if used at scale, would meaningfully reshape how these ecological decisions are being made. And I think there are reasons to hope, there are reasons to maybe even expect that the ecological decisions made through this route would be better than the ones that are currently being made largely by shareholders and those who have captured the state. And I use that phrase, state capture, advisedly. I think South Africa is one of the few places that seems to have a very robust conversation around the capture of state institutions for private interests. There's been a lot of really good commentary on that in the South African context that I've been fortunate to learn from. And that brings me to the second and final aspect of redistributing power that I wanted to talk to you about today, which is energy governance. If you had asked me even a couple years ago what was possible to change as far as how energy is governed, if it were meaningfully possible in places that had largely private sector provision of energy and other utilities, to make those publicly owned and constrained by the unions that represent the workers who work in that sector, I'm not sure I would have given you a very optimistic answer. But just earlier this year, just a few months ago, there was a major victory in New York in a campaign affecting the largest state power authority in the United States that granted renewable energy generation authority to the state power authority, and did so with kind of gold standard union language. So the projects must be protected by collective bargaining, and has just transition language in it as well. So candidates who lost employment in oil and gas sector would be prioritized for these renewable energy projects. So it's really a much larger victory for public provision for democratic control over renewable energy generation than I would have thought previously possible. And I'm bringing this up, of course, because this is related to the Green New ESCOM, which you all are working on. But one more example, in Ecuador, there's been a large grassroots campaign that's just succeeded in fighting for a democratic referendum over whether or not they should strand their oil assets in a national park. So fighting against extractivism there, and fighting to protect the forests and to protect indigenous land and livelihoods there. So I think there have been some very serious victories for making democratic decisions over these important ecological aspects of our social system. And I just want to end by pointing out some things that have been learned from some much smaller pilot projects in South Africa. This is a paper that I've been checking out over the past few months, which holds that not just ownership of renewable energy, but the decision-making about it needs to be shifted a bit out of technocratic hands and more to the general public. And they, at least the authors of the study, having reviewed 2 pilot programs by Eskom, were of this opinion and argued for this conclusion. They linked some of the problems in that pilot project to the technocratic management of the eco-village that was set up by Eskom. This was just outside of Stellenbosch. And they argued that a more decentralized, more democratic control design for renewable energy and for the decision-making over renewable energy might help build energy democracy and better ecological outcomes. So decentralized designs that build community energy projects and give direct democratic control to the people withdrawing energy from those systems while maintaining a centralized grid might get the sweet spot where you have the sort of economic benefits and energy resilience benefits of a centralized grid while having the political benefits of direct democratic control. So I think these are the kind of these are the hard questions about what the institutions we should be building are and what they should look like and how they should be managed that we'll have to be asking and answering over the next few years. But I think it's the kind of project and the kinds of questions to be asking rather than just where the money is coming from and who's going to provide it. And this, of course, sits in a larger landscape of political decision-making, and we could democratize those questions as well. A economic system where transit is centralized and available on a mass scale will have much different energy requirements and much different political dynamics than one where those things aren't true. So I think the questions we should be asking ourselves are not just how to do these specific energy projects and who would have power over them, but how they fit into a broader political landscape. And those are the kinds of construction projects that we have to take on. But I just want to recap and say, this is where I think the constructive view takes us. It's not this heady, abstract, rebuild the world in just an abstract sense of wanting better things, but it's really getting down to these sorts of details of what projects are we fighting for, what level of control do we want to have over them, and what does that control look like? So we get all the way from a big thought about the last 5 centuries to a specific thought about a specific eco-village, and that's the kind of flexible movement through scale that I think we're going to have to, as a group, get comfortable with doing. I'm going to leave it there. I'm looking forward to talking with you all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Taiwo. I really appreciate that a very insightful presentation. So maybe I'll get things kicked off with a question while people start mulling over what they'd like to ask the professor. So feel free to raise your hands or to type in the chat. I think we do welcome people to come off mute and say their questions if they'd like, but you can use the chat if you have connection difficulties or anything like that. And we're also monitoring the Facebook live stream for questions that are happening there too. So my question is kind of connecting two pieces of your work, Professor Taiwo. One is the elite capture work that you do about how identity politics is kind of taking a lot of these progressive ideals and they're being captured by the elite to, serve non-progressive aims. And they say that because in South Africa, we have this sort of situation where the ruling African National Congress, and particularly those in the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy, are trying to claim the sort of decolonial rhetoric in the service of a lot of Western oil and gas interests, quite honestly, in service of Shell, in service of other big oil and gas companies, and often against the actual local community have been fighting colonialism and apartheid for a long time. So, for example, in the Shell case, we had some local communities in the former Transkei of South Africa who were fighting against this as part of, generations-long struggles against colonialism, against Shell's oil and gas. And the Minister of Mineral Resources and Energy, Gwede Mantashe, accused them of apartheid and colonialism of a special kind, kind of harking back to what's sort of like a white environmentalism that has been historically, excluding communities, but this time against the Black community fighting against Shell oil and gas, Dutch multinationals. So I wondered if you could speak a little bit to how maybe questions of reparations can sometimes be appropriated and maybe strategies to push back against that.
Yeah, I think, there's definitely been a lot of cynical appropriation of radical and revolutionary rhetoric, especially by the emergent political elite on the other side of the anti-colonial movements and civil rights movements of the 60s and 70s. There's a lot of in the US where I live and where I grew up, we're facing a lot of this now, where landlords and prosecutors are using the kind of language to defend mass incarceration that and harking back to the kind of revolutionary figures that the people who are fighting those things would also, I think, more appropriately claim. And in South Africa, it's sounding like the same is happening on the side of extractive industries. And on the one hand, I kind of have a mixed view of this because, on the one hand, I think if you're comparing it to the 1920s, if you're comparing it to a century ago, there is a kind of dark sense in which it's an improvement because 100 years ago they wouldn't have had to lie about what their values actually were. They could have said, no, we just don't think those people deserve clean water. We think those people deserve to have to deal with the problems of extraction, and we just don't care what the outcomes are for them. And so now they have to grasp at anything. So I do think there is a sense in which this is at least a problem that is preferable to an earlier problem, but it is still a problem, right? It's still a problem that they're muddying the waters about what these analyses actually mean and what anti-colonial politics really demands of us. And I think what it's gonna, my guess, my sense of what it will take is actually is actually the same kind of, constructive view that I've been pushing in general, right? So my perception is that part of the reason why political elites are so effective in taking this language is because the language is really perceived generally as just language or as just symbolism, right? Anti-colonialism is an aesthetic, or anti-colonialism is a demographic, right? There are certain kinds of people who get to claim that whatever decision they make is, in service of Black liberation because they themselves are Black. And the more we attach our understanding of what anti-colonial politics means to specific political outcomes, to specific political decisions, rather than to figures or symbols or ways of talking, I think the harder it will be for political elites to appropriate it. So it will be clear that, if anti-colonialism just means an opposition to extractivism, as opposed to anti-colonialism means a way of talking that could be applied to extractivism or anti-extractivism, I think that will be harder for them. So that's my instinct, I guess.
Thanks very much. I appreciate that helpful answer. I see that Tara has written a nice long question in the chat, so I'm going to call on her to speak to her question. Tara, do you want to come in?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I really enjoyed reading your book and this idea of kind of world making as a constructive approach to reparations. And one of the things that you mentioned is that the burden of world making should be placed on those with kind of greater moral liability. But I just wanted to hear your thoughts, because I guess I was thinking about this, and with that potentially comes a responsibility and more power. And so how do we navigate that then placing this burden of responsibility also potentially places more power on the same group of people, and that also potentially places more power with them in shaping this new world? So I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it gets to what I was hinting at when I talked about aid, and in particular aid conditionality, right? So I think for exactly the reason you're pointing out, it's really important not just that money is transferred, but the conditions under which, the rich countries take on the financial burden. For example, that's just one kind of burden assignment we can make, or the polluting companies take on the financial burden, right? If what we mean is we tell them to give money to environmental initiatives, we demand that from them, or we make it a norm, what we're going to get is the carbon offset market that we've seen, right, which is largely fraudulent, and there's a lot of downstream political problems of people being evicted from land and so on. There's a million things wrong with the carbon offset models. What we get is ESG, right? These fake portfolios where companies and banks and asset managers claim to be investing in environmentally responsible ways, and there are myriad reports demonstrating that they're not doing that. What we get is aid conditionality, where rich countries claim to be sending development aid and assistance, and are in fact essentially buying governance of other places, where they can threaten at any time to withdraw the aid, or put conditions on providing the aid that essentially take decision-making power out of the hands of the people receiving the aid, and then it stops looking like aid at all, right? So I think it's really important that we design ways that put the financial burden where it should be, without giving them more power, just like you said, Tara. So that's part of my rationale for talking about things like participatory budgeting, say instead that what we required is that Exxon and Saudi Aramco and BP have to kick in money into participatory budgeting programs in a variety of countries, and that's it, right? The decisions of what will be done with that money are left entirely to the people participating in those processes. That might be a way to impose the financial burden on them while also transferring the political power of what to do with the resources, which is, part of why we want to get money out of these people in the first place, right? It's not as though having numbers on a spreadsheet is itself the thing we're after, but having self-determination, having control over the ecological circumstances that we live in, the political circumstances that we live in. I think that's what we should want. And so I think participatory budgeting, I think citizens' assemblies that have real legislative power, I think energy democracy, direct democratic control over how energy is built and who gets it, particularly over renewables. I think those are the kinds of political directions we should be trying to think of and trying to find workable designs for.
Yeah, I think that's some really interesting points that you make there, but I still, and I agree in theory, but I like I guess the question of like how do we actually get people in positions of power to actually act in accordance with that, like how do we motivate for people to actually do that. I guess I don't expect you to have the answers to that necessarily, but I guess that's just something that I'm struggling with.
Yeah, I mean, it's the big question, and I think it's not by chance that something like participatory budgeting, for example, originates with a workers' party, right? So ultimately, as Frederick Douglass said, power concedes nothing without demand, right? If you are just asking the people in power to do something that will vastly limit their power, maybe we're not going to get that far. On the other hand, if it's clear to the people in power that things are going to go badly for them if they don't make this concession, one tried and true way of putting that kind of pressure on elites is the credible threat of sector-specific strikes or even general strikes. Then I think your leverage to extract concessions is a lot greater. And so I think it's a really encouraging sign that the Climate Justice Coalition, if I understand correctly, is working with unions, because I think that's the kind of leverage, that's the kind of political power that you need, especially representing, kind of grassroots politics, to get people in power to concede. And I in the US, there's a conversation around what they're calling bargaining for the common good, which is just explicitly doing this, right? The workers who are renegotiating their contracts are partnering with other community organizations, other activist groups, and fighting for things beyond, work and compensation conditions for their members, and using their position, their leverage as workers to fight for broader policies. The first climate strike was fought over green cleaning materials in Minnesota here in the US. In LA and Chicago, unions have fought the city over its policies on immigration and policies on homelessness using worker power. And I think that's the kind of tactic that has been used to win climate concessions and could continue to be.
Thanks very much, Prof. Taiwo. I think the points that you're making, particularly around the importance of participatory budgeting, rings quite true for us here in South Africa, because I think there's a big difference between climate finance and the climate finance that meaningfully is reparations and has participatory budgeting in it. Because we're recipients, we're the pilot country for what they call these just energy transition partnerships, which is where typically Western countries come together and promise climate finance as a part of trying to shift quite coal heavily dependent countries to renewables. And one of the critiques that both our trade union partners and coalition members have been making is that this process was very far from participatory. The president's office dropped like a 200-page document on the public sort of the night before one of the big UN climate summits, and then said we'll sort of consult about it after. And it's pretty far from sort of participatory budgeting. And so I'm wondering if you've seen sort of examples of climate finance itself that are more participatory, or if this is quite a structural problem of climate finance being, quite technocratically driven top down by World Bank, IMF, and so on, often with conditionalities and so on, maybe replicating some of the neo-colonial structures that we're fighting against.
Yeah, I've been on the lookout. I haven't found anything that looked to me to originate from the kind of multinational UN, IMF, World Bank level of politics and then end up in a participatory place. Actually, if anyone here knows of an example, I would love to hear of that. But I think the closest thing to the kind of decision making that I've been hoping for are those examples I talked about really quickly at the end. So in Ecuador, the national level referendum they're having over whether or not to strand the oil assets, and in Portugal and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, there's also been some relevant participatory budgeting in Mozambique, where participatory budgeting, using funds that I think were in those cases provided by national governments, right? So not the international system like you're saying, but have taken it upon themselves to put that funding in ways that, in directions that I think would be good for the climate and the broader ecology. And I'm particularly encouraged by those decisions being made in Ecuador around agroecology. I think that's an example in particular that would be worth some attention and study. So I do think that if we had more bottom-up decision-making processes, especially on the money coming from the international system, I think we'd be in a much better political position.
Thanks, Prof. Taiwo. And this maybe connects to a question that was on the Facebook Live, which was from Sonny Morgan, who's one of the coalition members, he's part of Debt for Climate. And he's asking whether what you think about debt cancellation from World Bank and IMF as a tool to pay reparations. And maybe after that we can go. I see Lungisa's also raised a hand for a question too.
Yeah, I think the Debt for Climate, the Debt Jubilee, the campaign, the various debt cancellation campaigns are really important, right? Because we're not just talking about money flowing from the global South out of those countries, sometimes to other global South countries, sometimes to the global North, which is bad in and of itself. But also, if we're talking about the crowd out problems, right? So the more of a government's balance sheet that's directed towards debt service, the less of it can be directed towards social services and the effects of that compound, right? Having to start a health service or start an expansion of a health service 15 years into heat waves and floods is not the ideal way to do all those things. So it's not just stealing money, it's stealing time effectively. So I think debt cancellation is really important. I don't think it should be the only thing that we go for on the finance side of things, because, unfortunately, I mean, as the conversation in South Africa around state capture shows, right, we can't necessarily expect the state to use the additional fiscal flexibility from debt cancellation in ways that are necessarily the best in every circumstance. There are some governments that will make broadly good decisions, some governments that probably won't. I don't think it will ever be to our disadvantage to cancel Global South debt, or I don't think it will likely be to our disadvantage. But I think the gains from debt cancellation won't get us all the way there. So it's definitely a piece that should be part of what we fight for, but not the entirety of it.
Thanks so much. Appreciate that answer. Lungisa, do you want to come on in?
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Thanks for that intervention, Prof. I'm just curious. When I look at the lens you use, the constructive view, it really works really well, because I see that it lets go of a lot of baggage that we've carried when it comes to the question of reparations, of the way it throws things forward, and to sort of remake the world and address all the historical injustices quite comprehensively. Now, my question is that I'm curious about the types of pushback you've been getting, the critiques, and especially I'm wondering, for example, how other people, like, for example, the indigenous peoples of the Americas, how are they seeing your articulation? Because the way I see it, your lens allows for quite a comprehensive understanding. So I'm just curious if there's any pushback from folk, because I see in the States, like, there's the talk around reparations already, where it just give people money, where it's sort of the concept you're talking about, repair, where it's just stuck there, it stays in the past, it keeps creating drama, people are fighting, and your lens tends to drop all that baggage. So I'm just curious what kind of pushback you've been getting. Cheers.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, I think there's been a few kinds of pushback. I think one kind of pushback that I was especially getting in the early stages, when it was still a paper, and around the time that the book was first out, was around the environmental connection, right? But I still get this kind of pushback, right, where people think, what reparations is about is, rebuilding the wealth of people who have been plundered. It's about rebuilding land access for people who, especially in the States, a lot of Black farmers lost their land due to racist policies over the years, and that interacts in tricky ways with indigenous politics here, obviously, because it was their land, right, originally, right, and remains, right. There's one question about whether or not I've changed the subject, essentially, from cash transfer, or wealth transfer more generally, which I think is more traditionally what people associate with reparations, to something that's more ethereal, more broad scoping, and so that's one kind of pushback, and my response to that has just been, why do you want the land, right? There's a bunch of land in Florida that you could probably get right now, right, because it's going to be underwater in 10 years. Is that the land you want? No. Why? Well, because the reason you want land is because you want broader, presumably the reason you want land is because you want not just a higher level of consumption, but you want a broader level of control over your life. And the question is, are you going to have that if someone gives you a $2,000 check now, given the possible trajectory of climate change, or even a $20,000 check, or, you know, I'm not sure what numbers people are imagining. But my question is, my perspective is that the things that determine those broader questions of self-determination are going to be very straightforwardly ecological, and, you know, people disagree with me. So I think that's one set of pushback. And then just to speak to the point of view of indigenous politics that you brought up, which I think is also important. I'm not sure that I would call it. I'm not sure exactly how to characterize this response. But something that I was trying to be careful about in writing the book, and that came up in my presentation of the changing in what I just said about changing the subject and land loss, is the interaction with the land back movement. So indigenous groups in what's in North America broadly have been, of course, calling for land back and fighting for that in a variety of ways. And, you know, there's a question about how the reparations movement, which especially here in the United States is more associated with African Americans, specifically interfaces with that broader land back movement, especially if I'm widening the scope to think about transatlantic slavery and colonialism in linked ways. And so, you know, that's a question people have asked. Some people are of the opinion that, you know, reparations and land back are just two different conversations and they shouldn't be conflated with each other. Some people are of the opinion that they're related conversations and they should at least be had together, even while recognizing their distinction. Some people are of the opinion that they're ultimately the same conversation, or at least there's a larger conversation that includes both of them, and that larger thing is the thing that we should be having. And I'm not sure where I would come down. I think somewhere in between the second and third of those possibilities as of now, but that's just a kind of open question that I think has come out of a few discussions that I've seen and had around the book.
Thanks so much, Prof. Taiwo. I don't know if Lungisa, if you want to follow up on that. Otherwise, I also see that Richard, you have what is either a question or a comment on in the chat. I don't know if you'd like to speak to it.
Yeah, I'd love to. Thanks. So thanks so much for that great overview of the analysis, and particularly picking up on what you were saying about energy democracy, and, you know, mindful that with the emergence of information technology, nascent artificial intelligence, and access to electricity becomes ever more central to power. And so the whole issue of access to electricity becomes, not that it wasn't before, but even more of an issue of social justice. And so I was just wondering if you'd like to maybe elaborate a little along the lines of how you think that kind of framing might best be used. I mean, I immediately think of the South African context, and, you know, is this another lens to bring to advocacy for provision of electricity that might help to get more people on board with a strong political demand for that? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. I really think so. I mean, I'm convinced of this. I'm convinced of the connection, the political connection between the importance of energy access and energy provision and democratic energy provision to justice in general for a lot of reasons. And I'm convinced of the connection of the lack of democratic control and energy access to racism and colonialism in general. But it's just so straightforward in my view in the South African context. And obviously I'm not South African, you all can tell me if I'm wrong, but, you know, my understanding of the history is there is an electricity utility in South Africa specifically out of the history of colonial extraction of gold and minerals. And that is the reason for electrification and for much of the first few decades of the development of the original energy utility, that was the primary logic around who it was provided for and what was provided for. So the electric utility exists. It's an apartheid era institution that was created to fuel the extraction and looting of South Africa for the benefits of a very, whichever people stood to gain financially from that extraction. And I think, there is an opportunity in the South African context to have a level of clarity on the connection between reparatory justice and public power and electricity access. It's possible to have a level of political clarity about that in the South African context that I don't think it is possible to have anywhere else, or at least is not as straightforward in most other places. I shouldn't say every other place, but most other places is much more difficult to draw that connection. South Africa, it seems straightforward, and it seems potentially worth doing.
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to encourage folks to raise their hands if they have other questions, but I'll just comment on what you just said there, Prof. Taiwo. I think it's really pertinent because this is a central part of the Climate Justice Coalition's Green New Eskom campaign, is recognizing that Eskom historically was this apartheid project that drove the minerals energy complex. And sadly, what we've seen since the democratic birth of South Africa is that we've got a new set of elites that are using it as part of an extractive project. And so we haven't had, while we've had the political end of apartheid, a lot of those economic structures of extraction are still very much there. And Eskom has been, one of the central sites, both for that extractive logic, but also for state capture too. So the Green New Eskom campaign is centrally about how do we push back against that,
Yeah, and just quickly, I think it's the combination, thanks for adding that, Alex. I think it's the combination of the fact that it has this clear linkage to racist colonial history, and the fact that now in the present South African context, there's such a clear conversation around state capture, right? So you can just say, it's not as though the anti-apartheid fighters and activists were fighting so that, the Guptas could be the extractors rather than the old guard, right? They were fighting for a different system entirely, and the Green New Eskom could be a vision for what that would look like.
Yeah, that's very much our hope. And indeed, I think what's important is that there's that continuity of state capture. It's from the apartheid days and it continues. It's not like it was new. And I think sometimes there's this, particularly in white South Africans' minds, a little bit of a blind spot to the fact that this is not something that is brand new, but is a continuation. I see Tara's got a hand. Tara, do you want to come in again?
Yeah, sorry to come up in with a second question. I feel like I'm taking up too much space here, but this is maybe more a question on the scale of interventions, and I haven't fully formulated this question, but so I think there are lots of different scales of interventions and initiatives. Like, for example, in South Africa, you have a lot of community-based struggles that are like anti-extractive struggles, but you might also have, like something that might be more, so now we have the Eskom, Green New Eskom, that's more national. And I guess in this kind of world-making project, how do we also ensure that we enable those kinds of contextual differences that exist at the different scales and don't, I guess, dominate over smaller scale initiatives for creating a new world and kind of create, I guess, the kind of coming back to this the concept of like almost a plurivision or a pluriverse of options. How do we enable that as well? Yeah.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot, and I think, part of why I like the kind of participatory budgeting model is because it's, necessarily sort of multi-centric, right? Like you can only do a town hall with so many people, right? And so the kind of natural way that gets bigger is not by having necessarily just one big, participatory budgeting seminar, right? Because once you decide who gets to do that and why, I one model you might end up with is just back at regular old representative democracy where people run for office, right? I do think you can, with sortition, random assignment, you can have meaningful direct democratic processes that cover large amounts of people, but you need to get creative about it. But more often what people have done is just had more participatory budgeting centers and more zones that are covered by those processes, more towns, more cities, more counties, more provinces, expanding the number of events. I think too often when you say that you want something to scale, what people imagine is a larger project. And I actually want to bring this to water. I was kicking myself. I wanted to, say something about the South African water crisis and in general the contribution of water to the climate crisis, which by some scientists is just as pivotal as carbon emissions. They say to the climate crisis and broader ecological crisis. Some argue even more. But what some people imagine when you say you want a bigger scale intervention is like a literally bigger intervention, right? So we start off with a bunch of wells, and what you need to do on this logic to do bigger scale water intervention is to have a huge dam that dams the entire river, and like that's the way you affect water at scale. And that is the way that is often preferred by central administrators, national elites, right? It gives them one big project they can manage. It gives one big opportunity for profiting that can go to whoever's most efficiently captured the relevant regulatory bodies. There's a lot of reasons why national bureaucracies prefer to scale things that way. But we should realize, another way you can a project that starts with 10 wells is not necessarily by building a huge river-sized dam, but you could just have more wells. You could have 1,000 wells instead of 10. You could have 10,000 wells instead of 10. And I think the smart money is on that sense of scale, right? Just getting more communities involved rather than looking for bigger individual projects. And this is especially, the water crisis is a place where that kind of intervention makes an especially amount of sense. Every 1% of organic matter that you add to the soil in a city or in a village or in a township adds nearly 20,000 gallons of water holding capacity to that soil, right? So this is actually a thing that individual cities and villages and townships can meaningfully alter at the scale of their city and township without necessarily having rolled back the entirety of state capture, right? Like this is a thing, if you gave people a decent amount of money in participatory budgeting process, people really could just do this. They could just do this themselves, right? And I think looking for those opportunities and making, holding the state accountable, not to coming up with big projects, but for giving each and every community the possibility to decide on those projects themselves and the possibility to, and the resources to carry them out. I think that's a sense of scaling up climate intervention that is likelier to lead to good political interventions, that's likelier to lead to grassroots power building, that's likelier to avoid the worst problems of state capture and elite capture.
Yeah, I think, sorry, Alex, I'm just going to respond quickly, but I think that's another kind of, it feeds into another sort of thought process that I've been having around also solidarity, and like between networks. So if you have a network of solutions, there's also an opportunity for solidarity to exist between those networks, and also enhance kind of resilience. Kind of comes back to the energy systems that we might have in place in a South African context. But yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And they're talking, there's a coalition of organizations, the Eco-Social Pact of the South, which is across, I think, South America and Central America especially. And they talk explicitly in these terms, these kind of regional solidarity economies, right? For exactly the reason you're pointing out, right? It might just be, one city goes first, they try some water saving technique and they just tell other people about it because it works, and other people, because they've won, with unions and other kinds of grassroots pressure, they've won the kind of support from the state that can make carrying those things out possible. They just repeat it. And that's another way that we get to scale without waiting for the International Monetary Fund to be an institution other than the kind of institution that it is, right? Or without waiting for, serious reform to the World Bank or something. And I think that's, if my money was on a way of scaling up things that was likeliest to work, it would be that kind of solidarity model that you're talking about, rather than the kind of top-down approach.
Thank you so much. If there's any other questions, feel free to come in. Otherwise, I might just reflect back on the point that Professor Taiwo was making about the connection between land and reparations, particularly in the South African context. I mean, land redistribution is such a central animating question of our politics, given the fact that over 70% of land is still concentrated in agricultural land in the hand of white farmers, and also over 70% in the hands of men. So white men dominate the land ownership structures here. And so we, as a coalition, last month we hosted a workshop, a national workshop, where we discussed, it was called Owning the Renewable Means of Production. It was all about social ownership of renewable energy. And that land question just kept on coming back up. And one of the sort of agreements coming out of that is that one of our follow-up engagement has to be about the centrality of land to ensure social ownership of renewable energy, because how do you own it if you don't have the land to put it on, right? So it really became just a really central element of thinking about, more just renewables transition.
Yeah, I'm really excited about the connection between, I think people understand, especially people who are really deep in these movements, all the climate people understand that, that land is important, just as you were just saying. The agroecology people understand the importance of water. And I think, the more connectivity there is between those aspects of struggle for justice, and the clearer it is to people outside of those networks, I think the better we're going to do politically.
Definitely. And it seems like the constructive view of reparations is a big intersectional project. And so it is about tying all those things together and, thinking about world making in a way that can hopefully build interconnected struggle and see the interconnections that already exist I see we are getting towards the tail end of our 90 minutes. So I want to see if there's any last burning questions that folks have. Speak now or forever hold your peace, perhaps until our next engagement. Anybody have a burning question they'd like to bring in, or not even burning? Alrighty, going once, going twice. Oh, Lungisa, go for it.
Thanks. So since it's the last question, I got a weird question for you, Prof. Thinking about your work and thinking about, let me make it specific to South Africa. Since '94, all these positive ideas that we've had somehow get co-opted and end up, turning against the people. So I'm just curious with you, your work and this constructive concept you've come up with, which is such a breath of fresh air looking forward. I was just curious, do you wonder sometimes about how it could be co-opted and used against us? Just curious. Cheers.
Yeah, thanks. People in power are crafty. The more I study, especially the 70s and 80s, the more, let's say, fatalistic I am about that kind of thing. At the end of the day, I consider myself, whatever, I don't need to talk about that. But at the end of the day, this just isn't a power that words have, right? Words, slogans, symbols, they are flexible. That is part of their power, unfortunately, for good and for evil. And there isn't a way of talking that cannot be co-opted. I think the lesson that I take from seeing all these terms be co-opted is not to give up on the analysis that these terms stand for, but to give up on kind of conceptual clarity as the vision of what protecting those terms means, right? Like, at the end of the day, if you want solidarity to mean real solidarity, if you want, like, say, worker solidarity to mean worker solidarity, you don't need a more careful definition of the term worker solidarity or to be more critical of people who use it in bad ways. What you need are more picket lines and more picket line support structures. Right? That's the way that you defend getting worker solidarity to mean what it should mean. If people have more actual experience with supporting unions and that kind of thing. If you want, I'm not going to defend the idea of racial justice with a critique of Black prosecutors. I might be able to defend what it means if the prison abolition movement or something like it succeeds, right? Or that would be what it would be to defend it, right? And so, yeah, I mean, just as a thinker, as a curious person, I often wonder, like, to what extent, or to what extent these ideas are going to be co-opted. And it's not even really all that hypothetical. I could scroll through my inbox and see some of the things I've been invited to and refuse to go to, and see what use some of my political opponents are trying to make of these ideas. But I think the struggle is, as always, over the actual organization of society and not the way that we describe the organization of society. And we win when we get public renewables and when we fight back against killer cops, and when we fight for better wages, and the wins and losses that we should pay attention to are countable, they're observable, they're straightforward. And you all, from the sounds of it, are fighting for a very observable, big, important goal in Green New ESCOM. And you'll win or you won't, but it won't be because people lie about what climate justice means.
Thanks,
Thanks
Prof.
so much. Thanks very much, Prof. Taiwo, and we're immensely grateful that we were one of the emails that landed in your inbox that was accepted in terms of invitations. And I mean, we just a really big thank you for this talk, and also your broader work. It's really inspiring and helping us to think through a lot of big questions around climate justice, around reparations. I can say personally that I have drawn very heavily on your work and informing the work that you do. So we're immensely grateful and humbled and very grateful to have you here. So thank you so much. And I don't want to take up any more of your time because you've already given us a very generous 90 minutes. But maybe if folks want to, if people weren't showing their face for some reason, so you can show your face and clap if you'd like, or jump off mute and say thank you. But I just really want to share my appreciation. Thank you.
Yes, excellent. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody. Good luck. I hope to hear how things are going.
Definitely. And hopefully we can stay in conversation and solidarity too. I think it's a
Absolutely.
world building project, so we need to build across the world.